Okay, so this is part two of our discussion on employees in the hospitality industry. The first video I discussed legally selecting and hiring employees, and now once you've hired these employees, you need to manage them. And when you do, you need to do so legally. So there are some considerations to keep in mind in managing your employees legally. Um, I posted videos for you to reference in this section, but there were some things that I really wanted to expound on and thought it would be best to do it in the video instead of trying to answer questions later. So um, first thing first in managing employees is that you should have an employee handbook, although not typically required by law. You'd have to check each state law to confirm that, but it's typically not required by law. It is, however, recommended, especially by your lawyers. Anyway, in your employee handbooks, this is where you detail your company policies, benefits, employment practices and processes, including disciplinary processes, how employees might go about asking for time off, those kinds of things. And then sometimes you may actually have an employee's specific job description in that employee handbook. These are extremely important pieces of information and documents to keep on file. It helps you down the road, let's say, in the event that you discipline an employee and an employee comes back and says, I had no idea that I wasn't allowed to do that or that that was a violation of policy, you can refer them back to the employee manual that you gave them when they were first hired. So anyway, employment manuals, although kind of a pain and a little bit tedious to do, are highly recommended and can be extremely helpful to you down the line. And then also, it's really good for your employees to know where they stand and what to expect, and then they have more certainty as well. So it's a win-win for both you and the employees to have an employee manual. So a couple of other things I want to point out in legally managing employees. Sexual harassment is huge. That is a very big topic, and in fact, such a big topic that the state of California does require that you provide training to your employees, and you have certain deadlines by which to complete that. So that's a relatively new law that those trainings are now mandatory and required by law. Obviously, depending on what state you're in, it may not be required by law, but it is absolutely recommended, if not already required. That kind of training helps mitigate your liability as an employer in showing that you do have such a training program later in case an employee of yours does experience sexual harassment or files a sexual harassment claim and then later sues you. So anyway, if you have that training program, that's very helpful to you. A couple of things with regard to sexual harassment. It can be supervisor to subordinate, it can be employee to employee, but it can also be guests or vendors to employees. So we have not just the standard sexual harassment that most people think of in terms of a supervisor, you know, sexually harassing a subordinate. It can actually be peer to peer, but it can also be other guests or vendors that are harassing your employees, in which case you have a duty to your employees. As I mentioned in the last video, you have a duty to provide a reasonably safe environment for your employees. And so if guests or vendors are harassing your employees, you've not provided a safe environment if you don't take action or have a process in order to handle that. So you can mitigate your liability in a sexual harassment claim by making sure that you have the training that I mentioned. Take these complaints very seriously and investigate every single one. Even if it seems far-fetched or crazy to you, you are under an obligation to investigate it and to make that determination after a thorough investigation, not just I don't think this is right. That person's crazy. There's no way that actually happened. take all complaints seriously and have a process by which you handle those complaints. And then also make sure that your managers have specialized training in how to handle those complaints as well. So, those are all things you can do to mitigate your liability in sexual harassment claims. The slides have a little more detail on the types of sexual harassment and the definitions, so I'll refer you to those. But I wanted to highlight just a couple of things. Uh, Next, on legally managing employees that I want to highlight is compensation. That really boils down to, in terms of legally compensating your employees, the big component there is the minimum wage. Minimum wage has a federal level, a state level, and a local level. So there is the federal minimum wage, which is lower than most state minimum wages. And then you have the local minimum wage, which tends to be higher than the state minimum wage. State minimum wage cannot be lower than the federal minimum wage, and the local level minimum wage can't be lower than the state minimum wage. So as you get lower into different depths of government, there are different levels of government, federal reigns supreme. So you cannot go below that federal level. And then a state, and most do, pass their own minimum wage laws, and those are obviously higher than federal. And then again, the local is higher than state. It certainly can't be less than, it can be equal to or more than. Pay particular attention in what locality you are in. For instance, the San Diego minimum wage is different than the San Francisco minimum wage. So it is really important for you to know what that local minimum wage is, so that you do not run afoul of those minimum wage laws in compensating your employees. And the slides actually have the different statutes on a federal level that discuss the minimum wages in terms of the Fair Labor Act and those kinds of things. Another thing to note is that the state of California is not a tip credit state. So your tipped employees must make the minimum wage for your jurisdiction. There are states that are tip credit states. And what that means is that you can pay less than the minimum wage, with the assumption that the tips being made cover the gap in order to reach at least the minimum wage. State of California does not do that, so you have to pay all of your tipped workers minimum wage. So yes, your servers are making minimum wage just as much as your dishwasher may be making minimum wage, and your servers get to keep their tips and are not required to share those tips. There's tip pooling situations where that might be something that's set out in the beginning, but if it is a straightforward, typical restaurant where a server gets tips directly from the customer, those servers get to keep those and are not required to tip out the kitchen, as you know has been customary in the past. So anyway, so that's just a little note on minimum wage or compensation. Next big topic in legally managing your employees is evaluating and disciplining your employees. The goal here is to avoid a wrongful termination claim or discrimination claim after you've terminated an employee. A couple of things that will help you mitigate your liability in your exposure to a wrongful termination include evaluating your employees regularly and making sure that you're consistent in the timing and method that you use to do that. So if you evaluate your employees, say, okay, we do a yearly or an annual review, or we do one quarterly, or we do one biannually, whatever it is, make sure it's consistent across the board for everyone in that position, and then make sure that you're consistent. One of the things that you hear oftentimes is, yeah, I was supposed to have my review, but it hasn't happened, for weeks or months. Do not get into that. I know everybody gets busy and it's hard sometimes to stay on track with those, and it's hard to manage the employee files, but Set up calendar reminders. Do not let those lapse because that could create some problems for you down the line. Um, and if you are an employee and you haven't had your evaluation yet, and they're supposed to be annually, because that's what the company says, maybe talk to your supervisor and say, hey, I need to have my annual review. So anyway, so make sure that you do regular evaluations and that you're consistent in the timing and the method by which you do those. And when I say the method, make sure it's, the same method each time, or, certainly same method that you're using for other employees in that same position. It can be position specific. It doesn't have to be organization. It doesn't have to be the same for the entire organization, because different job functions may require different types of evaluation methods, but that method needs to be the same and consistent for each job function, so that one front desk agent is being evaluated in the exact same way as another front desk agent, if that makes sense. But you may not be evaluating a front desk person the same way that you would evaluate, say, a catering and sales manager. So those are different positions that might have different ways and methods of evaluating, but must be the same within that job function. And then another way to mitigate a wrongful termination claim would be to have your policies in written form, your policies and procedures in a written format, which are in the employee manual that I mentioned earlier. And then try and avoid on-the-spot terminations. That's a good idea. If you have an employee and you just fire them on the spot, that could be a real problem. Instead, what seems to be favored, again, not required by law, but certainly recommended by your attorneys and industry standard and human resource professionals, are that you do a progressive disciplinary program. So instead of somebody messing up and you're like, that's it, you're done. Instead, what you do is you walk through a process of verbal warnings. The slides actually break this out and say a verbal warning, but then they also say a written or a documented verbal, they say a verbal warning, and then they say a documented verbal warning, which I would suggest that even like your basic verbal warning should be documented no matter what. So I think those two can be collapsed together and just say verbal warning, but make a little note in the employee file that you did give a verbal warning, and determine how many verbal warnings you might give before you then move on to a formal written warning where the employee signs that. And then you might progress into suspension and you might progress into termination. Now, I want to bring your attention to your duty that I've mentioned to your other employees and to your guests to provide a reasonably safe environment. I discussed that in terms of selecting your employees, that you need to select employees that are actually qualified and that are not going to pose a risk of harm or danger to your guests and your other employees. The other cause of action here is negligent retention. So if you keep an employee, let's say you hire the employee and you had no reasonable way of knowing that they would pose a risk of harm, but then you have the employee and they're working for you and you're now in the point of managing and evaluating your employees, it comes to your attention that they actually do pose a risk of harm to your other employees or your guests, or maybe even other vendors or anyone that's in your space. Now you have a cause of action and a duty to not keep that employee. So you could be in trouble for negligent retention if you keep that employee in spite of your knowledge that they could pose that risk of harm. So as you're going through your disciplinary process, going back to that on the spot termination and how it's disfavored, in some instances, if there is such a high risk of harm, you may have to get rid of that person on an emergent basis, and in which case that would be a very extreme circumstance. But my point in bringing this up to you is that, there's the recommended process and having that in writing and thinking that through. but then also know that in some cases this might need to be weighed in different circumstances and take that on a case by case basis when something is like beyond normal. Obviously, if somebody is late, that's pretty common. Following that progressive disciplinary plan makes sense. But if somebody's pulling a knife on, let's say a line cook pulls a knife on another line cook, maybe that progressive disciplinary plan might not be the most effective here. So just use your good judgment. But generally speaking, for most of employee discipline, follow that progressive plan as much as you can. It's not a fail safe in terms of making sure that you won't get sued for wrongful termination, but it certainly helps mitigate your liability in getting that wrongful termination claim. And even if you do get sued for wrongful termination, if you have that program, that progressive disciplinary plan, and you have those regular evaluations and you have all your policies and procedures in writing, your outcome stands to be much better typically in the end. So if you do get sued and you can provide all those things, you have a much better chance of a good outcome than you would without those things. So that wraps it up for legally managing employees. I think you are going to get a lot of this in hospitality HR. So I didn't set up added assignments here because I wanted your focus to be on some of the other assignments that I think are more significant in terms of hospitality law in general. And again, knowing that human resources is a required class for you that I also happen to teach, and I know what your assignments are there. I didn't feel like we needed to be redundant here because I wanted to put your focus on your assignments and some other areas that are extremely important as well. All right, that wraps us up for the employee section of hospitality law.